At noon, the sun turned to copper. Not the radiant coin that used to warm necks and paint fields with clean shadows, but a dull disk that hovered without conviction, as if some giant hand had smeared soot across the sky and then forgotten to wipe it away. The light did not fall so much as leak, thin as watered ale, and what it touched it cooled rather than blessed. Breath fogged in what should have been summer. Cows stood facing a horizon that refused to glow. The bell in the little timber church sounded as it always did, but its voice went nowhere, trapped under a lid of ash that pressed the world down until sounds bent and gave up. They would remember that day, later as the first day of the long dusk, though no one announced the name then. People know when a season has been insulted. Market stalls held their produce like apologies. The baker waited for dough to rise and watched the lumps sleep through the morning. Birds flew low, then lower, then stopped and tucked their heads as if night had stepped into the wrong room. Children asked why the lanterns were lit while the rooster still wandered the yard. Answers arrived in careful pieces, perhaps a storm, perhaps a haze from far-off fires, perhaps God testing patience. No one said, not yet, that the light itself had grown tired. In a modest house where Roman stone met Saxon timber, Aliana counted spoons while her partner Wulfgar counted logs. Between their numbers lay two children, Ida and Bran, tracing horses on the hearth, soot with fingers they should have been dipping into cream by this hour. Old Brenna, who remembered other griefs and knew which herbs pretended to be food and which were honest about it, sat by the window with a small knife and a bundle of nettles. Father Osric stood at his own window across the lane, eyes on the church bell he could ring and the sky he could not. Each kept to a familiar task, as if holding the shape of yesterday might remind the day of its duties. The air tasted faintly of iron, the way a bitten lip does. Smoke that should have climbed from cook fires wandered sideways, confused, then slumped. Bees left their hives, looked around like strangers at a door that did not belong to them, and went back inside without doing the brave, collective thing that bees do. Pigeons misread the time and cooed with the low urgency they reserved for dusk, and because dusk had said the magic word, the village believed it. Who argues with the throat of a pigeon when your eye insists it's noon? Dogs padded to thresholds and lay their chins on their paws, ears awake, as if listening for a footfall in a house beneath the house. The first argument was not about causes, but about comfort. Father Osric raised the host in the dim church and said words that had been said 1,000 times, their meanings polished by repetition until they fit the hand like a familiar tool. Aliana crossed herself because the prayer made a shape in the formless light. Brenna muttered an older charm under her breath and tied a braid of grass above the door, because sometimes names from the old tongue sat better in the gut during strange weather. The village, which had been learning how to be both Roman and Saxon and something else besides, breathed together, let there be enough bread today, and enough reasons to believe tomorrow will still be called tomorrow. Food informed the truth. Wheat that would have pushed out clever green tongues by this week sulked under the ash. Barley sulked with it. Beans, those practical little sermons on survival, sat in sacks like unpromising stones. Brenna took Ida and Bran to the hedgerow and taught them the old alphabet of hunger. Nettle that bites until you ask it nicely with boiling water. Sorrel shaped like an arrowhead, sour enough to wake a mouth that wants to sleep through dinner. Ground elder that creeps like gossip but fills a pot. You don't need to like it, she said. You need to learn it. The liking can come later if it wants. Ida said nettle soup tasted brave. Bran said it tasted green. Aliana said it tasted like supper, and that was that. The animals read the wrong page and kept reading it. A heifer stared at the sun with the concentration of a monk and found no use in it. Hens went quiet, then quieted even more, then failed to produce the future of hens. A stray calf shivered, though it wore summer's coat, and Aliana pressed her ear to its side and listened to the weather inside the animal. A slow drum, a river pretending to remember which bank to favor. She warmed a mash of bran and nettle and whispered a half-remembered blessing over it. The sort of compromise a practical woman makes when the world argues theology with her pantry. The calf blinked its wet, confused gratitude and stood. Rules arrived without ceremony, because fear is a carpenter and knows how to measure. No one cooked alone after dusk, because smell travelled like gossip and wolves could spell. Grain would be pledged by head count, not by pride, and the arithmetic would be simple enough that even grief could do it. The storehouse key would hang where anyone could see it, on a nail in the chapel, between heaven's picture and the ladder for mending the thatch, in a place where you had to show your face and the right kind of intention to take it down. That was the plan. Plans are a kind of faith to hope came, as it often does, with ridiculous modesty. Aliana opened her door to fetch water and found, in the road, a small handful of beans scattered as if someone had carried too many in their fist and the fist had confessed its weakness mid-stride. She gathered them the way a person gathers the last bright berries from a frost-stung bush, not asking why they were there, only deciding that since they were, they could be used. "We'll plant what likes to work even when the sun is lazy," she said. Wolfgar's mouth tightened. He preferred enemies you could see. What would you do if noon looked like late afternoon and late afternoon looked like surrender? Would you go on calling meals by their old names, or rename them to be honest about their shrunk ambitions? Would you say grace with a full throat, or whisper it because the full-throated versions belonged to other summers? How many rules would you put between your family and the new heir? And would you make them out of love or out of fear? And could you tell the difference while your hands were cold? The children asked if this was a special day. Aliana said yes, and watched their eyes leap at the word. Then she said the special thing was that they would all do ordinary work and not stop until sleep found them far to the south. A mountain nobody in this village had heard of had thrown a tantrum big enough to write itself on their faces. They did not know that, and did not need to. The world does not send explanations with its injuries, and when it does, they arrive too late to matter. What arrived now was a sky the color of pewter and a sun that had misread its job description. The river ran as it always had, and yet the fish avoided nets as if the water itself had advised them to keep their secrets a little longer. Men named their nets because it is easier to talk sternly to an object with a proper noun. Trust is a larder with one door. When hands begin to hover near that door, even clean hands, conversation changes shape. The new rules asked for pledges measured in mouthfuls, and the pledges were made. And then the memory of those pledges began to itch under cloaks at night, when the ache behind the ribs asked why it was being ignored. Aliana slept lightly. Wolfgar pretended to sleep and listened to the house would speak. Brenna slept like an old tower, not much, but enough. Father Osric dreamed he was ringing the bell and found, when he woke, that his arm ached as if he had indeed tried to pull sound out of a heavy thing and send it up through a ceiling that refused it, by the second week of the wrong light. The children had invented a game of naming the colors the sky was not. "Not blue," said Ida. "Not gold," said Bran. "Not fair," said Aliana. and laughed because sometimes you choose laughter like you choose a scarf against wind. It doesn't stop anything, but it keeps one part of you from stiffening. People learned to walk by the lantern that hung outside the smithy, its sway a metronome for errands. The smith reported that iron felt different under the hammer. It is a comfort to a village when a smith admits the world is acting peculiar. It absolves the milk of having to apologize for souring. Rumors arrived with travelers who had misplaced the road and found it again. The haze was everywhere, they said, or everywhere that mattered to them, which came to the same thing. In some places, snow had fallen in a month that used to belong to wheat. In others, birds had turned round, mid-crossing, and come back to the wrong continent with wrong ideas. Far-off monks argued about prophecies, which is what monks do when paper is warmer than air. Far-off warriors argued about whether enemies had blocked the sun with smoke, which is what warriors do when their hands lack better work. The village listened and then returned to the arithmetic of jars. Work taught the body to believe in time even when the sky refused to cooperate. Nettles boiled into a respectable broth if you treated them with manners at the pot's edge. Sorrel brightened a mouth just enough that bread did not feel like a chore. Aliana kept the beans in a pouch on her belt and touched them as if they were beads on a rosary. Wolfgar mended a fence with an attention that would have suited a wedding. Brenna taught the children the difference between pine and fir when you are hungry, which is to say how to find the inner bark that keeps a person standing upright one more day. Father Osric practiced saying words that didn't sound like excuses, because no sermon should tell a hungry man that hunger is a metaphor. Naming helped. They called it the long dusk because to call it a night would have been a betrayal of mornings past and mornings promised. Dusk implies an after. Dusk reminds the mouth how to say soon. The word was a superstition and a plan in equal measure. Under it, people remembered how to share without claiming credit, how to wait without gawking, how to remove the pride from hunger and still keep the dignity. The bell rang for prayers and for meetings, and sometimes just to prove the bell still had a job in that first week. A heifer fell ill and then stood again, and the village decided that standing was a skill that could travel. The storehouse received sacks of grain marked with household notches and small, proud piles of dried mushrooms, reminding everyone that the woods had not yet revoked their citizenship. A jar of honey appeared on the chapel windowsill with no note, and the fact that no one took it home at once was proof that rules could be honored even when temptation was the size of a fist. In the same dawnless hour, someone tried the storehouse door, and then, hearing the prayer Father Osric hadn't meant to speak aloud, stepped back and went away with empty hands and a heavier heart. The idea of sending delegates to the bishop's next moot appeared in conversation the way smoke finds rafters, first thin, then thick, and then suddenly everyone was coughing on it. Who among them could walk through a grey day to a place where other minds had gathered to speak practical courage? Who could carry knowledge back without diluting it or adding sugar? Caden, Alina's cousin, wore silence well and remembered instructions as if they were tunes. Sister Edda from the monastery carried a satchel that bulged with drawings, of drying racks and instructions for leaching bitterness from stubborn food. They were not chosen yet, but the village began to look at them with the kind of hope that pretends to be ordinary regard. Every household built a small inventory of what could be spared and what could not. Oil became a measured blessing. Lamps were advisors, set at intersections in rooms so feet did not invent tragedies in the dark. The bed of ash beneath the hearth learned to hold coals through pretend nights. So a morning whenever a morning was could be coaxed from a careful breath and a splinter. Children learned not to waste breath on complaints that air took personally. Complaints cooled rooms. Songs warmed them. Brenner taught an old work tune without saying it was a prayer, and the refrain fit nicely inside the pace of chopping, stirring, mending. Hunger introduced itself politely at first, then stopped being polite. It asked to be consulted in every plan, and then demanded to chair the meeting. It is a stubborn accountant, hunger, always rounding numbers up and insisting on double-checking the math. People who had promised to wait until midwinter to take from the storehouse woke with the sense that midwinter had snuck up while they nodded. The rules held because the rules had faces attached to them, early, and Wolfgar's, and Brenner's, and Father Osric's, and the faces of children who looked at adults the way seedlings look at weather expectant. Not yet resigned. On the fourth day, ash sifted through the thatch like a gossip with nothing new to say. On the fifth, the river gave up to decent fish and a lesson, the net thrown slowly, with the patience of a man who had decided not to bicker with water, caught more than the net thrown like an accusation. On the sixth, Ida declared that she could tell the difference between honest and dishonest shadows, and no one laughed because everyone understood. Some shadows now were not the old companions of light, but something else entirely, a thickness in the air that meant nothing and everything, and then, in a moment that would be told 3 ways by 3 honest people, Aliana found the beans in the road. Perhaps they fell from a traveller's loosened pouch. Perhaps a child had played with them and been called in too quickly to remember. Perhaps they arrived like a small favour from a sky that was feeling guilty but could not manage a proper apology. Aliana held them in her palm and felt, not certainty, but the shape of a decision forming like a frost pattern on glass. Plant them. Plant what does not bully the sun for attention. Plant faith that looks like work. This is how the long dusk introduced itself, without thunder in the village lanes, without speeches from anyone born to give them, without a blamed enemy posting notices at the crossroads, the day cool as a cellar, the light as thin as a conscience. The people arranged in their old patterns, testing whether those patterns could carry new weights, beans in a hand, a braided charm above a door, a prayer said with teeth clenched, and then, the teeth unclenching, said again. The first promise is always small keep, 1 calf alive, keep 1 pot warm, keep 1 secret from turning into a habit. The second promise is larger and dangerous keep each other. What would you keep first, if keeping had to be chosen like a trade? Warmth or wheat? A tool or a tune? Which knowledge belongs in the front of the sack when the sky forgets to be kind? The name of an herb that forgives clumsy hands? Or the way to carve a lid that fits a jar so well mice hear their own ambitions and turn away? Would you send the loudest among you to bargain for help, or the one who listens until listening becomes a kind of seeing? Would you argue about the reason the sun has gone wrong, or teach the youngest how to stand on a stool and stir a pot safely with the handle that will not burn them? By the end of that first week, the village had learned 3 things it had not wanted to learn. First, that time can be made by people when the sky refuses to make it, stitched from tasks and counted in spoonfuls. Second, that trust is heavier than grain and must be carried together or it spills. Third, that hope is not a mood but a technique tied to recipes. 2 rows in a garden, to the way hands meet at thresholds to swap what each has more of for what each lacks. Aliana placed the beans in a small bowl and set them where everyone could see them. The way a family might set a photograph of a beloved relative in a room so that the household, remembers who it is trying to be. Outside, the air pressed its ear against the village and listened to the talk of pots and prayers and plans. Wolves wrote their letters on the hills and kept their distance, for now. Far-off traders tried to read the road with their feet and felt the old distances recalculating themselves without asking permission. The church bell learned to speak softly, so as not to embarrass itself amid so much muffled hearing. The heifer that had stood again chewed as if chewing were a political act, and perhaps it was. And the sun, poor, exhausted thing, sat in the sky like a coin someone had dropped and no one yet wanted to bend and pick up. The question inside every chest did not need saying to be heard. Do we wait for light to remember us? Or do we learn the names of foods that do not court it? The tricks of storing what is earned at great cost. The songs that make steps easier when feet doubt they are going anywhere. Somewhere beyond sight, a mountain sulked and would go on sulking. Here, in a place that had decided to be a village before it decided what to call itself, hands moved. That was the answer the village gave to a sky that had lost its manners. Hands moved. In the first week, the village discovered that time could be made out of tasks when the sky refused to make it out of light. The rooster still called because habit is a kind of faith. But his voice sounded embarrassed, as if he had arrived at a feast where the table was bare. Hens muttered through the half-light, and then, as if insulted by the tone of the day, stopped laying altogether. Cows drifted toward the fence rails and stood with their muzzles lifted to a horizon that no longer offered instructions. Once or twice the oxen blew sharply, the way a creature does when smoke surprises its lungs. The hives at the edge of the meadow hummed weakly for a morning and then fell quiet as kitchens after a quarrel. Bees nosed the air, traced a short circle as if the world had shrunk and retreated. The baker said the dough was sulking. The miller said the stone could turn forever and still depend on grain that was not coming. No one argued. The light itself seemed to be in a mood. Rationing began as a conversation and ended as law. There is a courteous interval between the two in any decent place. The village kept that courtesy even while it tightened its belt. Household ledgers appeared on tables that had been used for carving toys and mending cloaks. Aliana measured what was left with the care of a woman who knew by muscle memory the weight of a loaf when it is honest and when it is pretending. Wulfgar lifted each log before he stacked it by the hearth, counting not with numbers but with seasons. What would this one have meant in an ordinary winter? The answer was always too much and too little at once. Old Brenna unwrapped bundles of herbs as if she were introducing neighbours everyone had forgotten. Nettle, ground, elder, sorrel, cleavers, plantain. She named them without fuss and said what they offered when asked correctly and what they took when mishandled. Father Osric rang the bell and asked people to bring what they had pledged to bring, and to remember that the act of carrying grain to a common door was itself a lesson children would not forget. Elders compared omens with the gentleness of people holding fragile things. Brenna remembered a summer of smoke from the west when I was nobody's grandmother, and how goats coughed and men swore that lightning had learned new tricks. Wulfgar's father, who had died with mud on his boots and a joke unfinished, had once told of a fog the sea sent up the river like a dare. It had made the sun limp for days, and the fields had put on a sulky green as if they were acting to amuse themselves. Father Osric, with a humility the village respected him for, said that, while the Psalms offered poems for dark weather, they did not offer calendars. The elders let the words float. Aliana, who loved proof, kept her mouth closed and her hands busy. The second week presented the fields like an argument no one could win. Wheat shoots, that should have been impertinent lay flat, the color of washed linen. Barley hunched instead of rising. The village had always used the south wall of the old Roman granary for early. Greenstone held the dais, heat, and gave it back to tender plans at night, but now the wall seemed a patient that had stopped breathing properly, giving back less than it took in. Brenna walked along the garden edges with the two children, Ida and Bran, and the small pockets of heat the stones still exhaled were like handshakes from a tired friend. "Beans," she said, tapping her pouch, "are practical. They do not wheedle the sun. They do their sums quietly and still come out right if you don't insult them." Aliana had the fistful she had found in the road sitting in a small bowl where eyes would rest on them often. She borrowed Brenna's word, practical, and let it sit in her mouth until it tasted like a plan. Prayer became a rhythm that did not argue with work. Father Osric's chapel smelled of tallow and smoke and wool damp from the air. He chose readings that offered verbs more than adjectives: give, share, preserve, remember. He did not say the world was ending. He did not say it was not. He told a story about Joseph and storage and the dignity of foresight, and a story about ravens that were looked after, and asked his listeners to be the hands by which ravens were looked after in this place. Some crossed themselves. Others crossed their arms against the cold and listened without naming their agreement. On the way out, the wax tablet for pledges waited. People pressed their marks with the small pride of those who intend to keep promises, and a small fear of those who know how hard keeping can be when keeping means denying your own children a second mouthful. The wise women's lessons filled the afternoons that had forgotten how to be bright. Brenna showed how to strip nettle with firm fingers and no drama, how to blanch bitterness into usefulness, how to leach acorns until they admitted they were food. She spoke of pine in a bark and how not to confuse it with something that steals strength instead of giving it back. She taught Ida to crush plantain and make a spit bomb for lips that had begun to crack from air that was not cold enough to be honest about winter and not warm enough to spare skin. Bran learned a tune for stirring porridge that set his arm's pace. Songs measure time more kindly than ash does. Knowledge moved from older hands to younger ones in the language of doing. The children, who were learning to faiths without anyone insisting they named the difference, said thank you to Brenna's jars and amen to Father Osric's bread. No thunder visited to correct their theology. By the end of the second week, the bees had committed to their silence. Aliana stood by the hives and knocked gently the way her grandmother had taught her to pretend to inform the bees of weddings and deaths, so they would not feel left out of the village's heart. News, she said, though she had none to bring, and laid a ribbon of coloured thread on the landing board as if bright colour could coax them to remember they were makers of sweet. No buzzing answered. Brenna advised patience. Father Osric advised prayer. Wulfgar advised not relying on things that had chosen not to rely on themselves. The village altered its plan for light. Candles would be saved for the chapel and the birthing room and the dying bed. Elsewhere, tallow lamps would do, and rushes that took flame reluctantly but held it faithfully. Lamp smoke spoke rough to throats. People learned to drink a mouthful of water without ceremony and taught children to take that comfort like medicine. Slowly in the third week, the first calf fell ill. Not a dramatic collapse, no red mouth, no stumbling, but a low refusal. The animal looked at its feed with the same dull courtesy the sun used, and then put its head down as if the weight of its skull had increased since dawn. Aliana, watching it, felt that she recognized the expression. She had put it on herself twice that morning. moving through the rooms with her body insisting on work and her heart lagging behind. Not angry, just tired of the way day was being done. She knelt by the calf, pressed her ear to its side, and listened. The rumble of the gut was slow, and the breath whistled faintly as if the ash were whispering even inside the barn. She slid her hand under the jaw where heat tells the truth and found it to cool. She asked the world not to take this one. No bargains were offered. The world has never been tidy about bargaining. People came to the buyer and took turns, offering what they had seen defeat illness before. Brenna suggested a mash, warm bran, nettle, a thread of honey from the jar left anonymously at the chapel window 2 mornings earlier. Father Osric put his hand on the calf's flank for a moment, too short to be showy and too long to be accidental, and then stood back as if he had placed something on a shelf for later. Wulfgar fetched a cloth and heated it on a stone to lay over the calf's chest, muttering that heat was a kind of argument the body might heed. Someone remembered that ash on pasture can change the taste of everything and coax bloat to start trouble. Someone else swore that boiling water in the new air took longer to show its earnestness, and maybe it should be hotter. Aliana looked at the animal and watched its eyes, which held a dull dignity she respected. "Eat," she said softly, meaning more than the calf. They lifted the calf to its knees with the care people usually reserve for elders and infants. The animal stood because standing is a habit you lose quickly if you set it down for too long. It swallowed the mash as if surprised to find swallowing still in the body's library of motions. Its breath cleared a notch. "We will not call this a miracle," Brenna said, "because we might need the word later." They did not call it nothing either. The village learned something small but sturdy. When a living thing refuses, you offer warmth and patience before you offer despair. "Is it the ash?" someone wondered, "or something we can fix?" The answer, delivered in the calf's less labored breath, was indecisive and good enough for that day. The 4th week closed the door on the bees. No hum returned. The candles burned more quickly than they used to, perhaps because the air carried something that argued with flame, or perhaps because people watched more intently and time always shortens under inspection. The storehouse received its pledges, sacks marked with notches unique to each household, jars sealed with wax that had been treated like gold, ropes of dried mushrooms with the cautionary note that mushrooms tell the truth or a very cruel lie, and you must know which. Language they are speaking before you invite them to dinner. The key hung on its nail in the chapel, visible to anyone who wanted to mistrust the system, heavy enough to remind a hand of the weight of shame. Some evenings a person would walk to the chapel under the ashen sky and touch the key as if it were a relic and then walk home. Father Osric, who was not a fool, pretended not to see and lit a small lamp in the nave that served both as consolation and witness. Messages arrived from the monastery like thin loaves that could be made to last if sliced thoughtfully. A novice named Matthias came with his cloak powdered grey and his eyelashes carrying the lightest coat of ash-like frost. He delivered a sheet of careful notes from Sister Edda, methods for drying fish with less smoke, so the smoke could be saved for meats. A drawing of a rack that could sit by the south-facing wall to catch what heat the old stones still surrendered. A schedule for lamp oil that prioritized rooms where hands held needles and knives. Instructions for leaching acorns to drive bitterness into the water instead of the belly. The sheet also held a small benediction in plain handwriting that said, "The work is the prayer." Matthias said the bishop planned a moot in 2 months' time to share whatever was shareable. He looked at the sky the entire time he spoke, as if the clouds might interrupt with an opinion. The village began to talk about who to send when the moot was called. But talk was as far as they were willing to go, while the calf's breath had not yet regained its proper music and the fields sulked. In the 5th week, a trader tried the road and walked into the square with his packs hardly lighter than when he started. The ash braided into his hair like the work of a bored child. He brought news that the copper sun was not a local insult, but a temper held over many valleys. In some places south, he said, mornings arrived in name only. In others, people had decided to move their clocks to flatter the light and were eating breakfast at the old time of vespers. He had nothing to sell that the village needed more than what it had. He traded stories for soup and left with the bowl washed and a knot of bright thread for his wrist tied by Ida, who wanted to give him something that did not taste like compromise. By then, rationing had settled into the relentlessness of weather. No one cooked alone after dusk because the smell from a pot could travel like a rumor and would call wolves as surely as it called boys. Grain was weighed in the presence of neighbors, not because anyone had earned suspicion, but because trust is better exercised than stored. The village decided that the last loaf of the week would be blessed whether there was a priest in the room or not. The words were simple: we keep and we share, and they sat well in mouths unused to oratory. Children ate first. Old people pretended to have less appetite than they did and failed just enough that no one had to be theatrical about insisting they take another spoon. The 6th week brought wind that rattled doors without moving much else. It carried a faint taste of salt on one day and of stone on another, which led to the omnivorous speculation of people who must talk while their hands work. Perhaps the sea itself was boiling. Perhaps mountains were fuming old grievances. Perhaps the air had become a road and had decided it preferred to be travelled more than to be a proper sky. The animals developed new habits. Dogs slept with one ear up. The horses tried to save their own breath by moving in a way that made stepping look like thought. A hen, confused by the light that would not commit, settled herself on a warm cobble and muttered at passers-by, as if they had rearranged her furniture. The calf. Everyone called it the calf, as if it were the villagers. One experiment with hope had days when it looked at food, like a person reading a letter of mixed news, and days when it worked its jaw with honest enthusiasm. On a morning that looked like a late afternoon, Aliana found the animal standing with its head over the byre door, watching the yard as if waiting for a parade. She put her forehead against its forehead and counted to 7. "I will not get in the way of your decision," she said aloud, "but if you want to choose staying, I will work at that with you." The calf blinked in a way that made Ida clap her hands and declare the conversation settled. Work sharpened. The village built drying racks out of reclaimed slats and set them along the granary wall, as Sister Ida's drawing suggested. The small pocket of warmth that the stones offered less a gift than a habit was caught and used. Fish were cleaned with more attention. Nets, named and spoken to like stubborn cousins, were cast in the river with a patience that had matured into a practice. The difference showed. There were days when a pot held a shred more richness for the children than the day before. People learned to confess small errors without ceremony. A jar that had not sealed properly was not a shame. It was a lesson. And the lesson was offered in the square, so the next jar in someone else's house would snap shut, the way a lid should. Elders continued to compare omens, because story keeps fear from going feral. One said the copper sun meant a king would die. Another said it meant kings would be invented in places where no one had bothered naming them before. Brenner said the sky was behaving like a person who had been woken rudely. and the sensible response to such a person was to speak quietly and make tea. Father Osric looked at the fields and told a parable about seeds that sleep and seeds that keep watch, and said he would not determine which these were until they gave him permission to. Wulfgar sharpened tools with a concentration that would have suited a court case. Aliana counted beans twice a day, the way a friend might check a neighbor's breathing during an illness. Not to hurry it, but to be present. By the 7th week, the village had begun to know the shapes of the new days. They were not identical, which was merciful. One would bring the smell of rain, which arrived like a visitor who had left without paying and returned to settle the bill with a grimace. Another would bring a wind from the east that made everyone certain good news was walking toward them with a limp. Children learned the geography of the dim, where the smithy's lamp made a small square of confidence in the road, where the hedgerow hid a patch of stinging things that would sting less if you spoke to them while you cut them, where the chapel's door leaked a line of warmth that made a person straighten their spine without deciding. 2 in the 8th week, Wulf came down to the far field and decided the village was a story it was not ready to believe yet. It left prints that Ida measured with her palm and declared large enough to need respect but not our fear. The prince made Wulfgar inspect the fence, lines and repair what time and weather had done to them. He worked with the calm that arrives when a man understands the limits of his role. He could not fix the sky, but he could ask a fence to behave. That evening, Brenna taught the children how to hang bells low on the outer gate where wind could gossip with them. The faint chime would mean something before it meant more. Through all of this, the question repeated the way a necessary word repeats in a prayer. Is this the ash, or something we can fix? People learned to separate insults they had to bear from insults they could answer. The ash stole warmth and dimmed the day. That was a theft without a door to knock on. But jars could be sealed. Beans could be planted in cold frames made from old window glass rescued from a ruin. Porridge could be thickened with ground acorn meal if leached until even an honest tongue could tolerate it. Light could not be coaxed back by virtue, but its absence could be answered by technique and the gentle tyranny of schedules. Aliana rose in the not-quite morning and put a pot of water on before her eyes had decided what hour to be. Wulfgar chopped wood in a measured rhythm that asked his breath to agree. Father Osric warmed the church slowly and allowed himself 1 extra candle's worth of extravagance on the day the calf ate without coaxing. No one pretended courage was constant. There were hours when Aliana held the bowl of beans and felt nothing but the ache of her hands. There were hours when Wulfgar, who preferred clear jobs, looked at the sky and disliked it with a helpless dislike that made him silent through supper. Brenna forgot the words to a song she had known since she was the age Ida is now, and wept for the lost tune as if it were a friend. Father Osric, who had found a way to be useful without pretending to be in charge of weather, stared at the altar so long one afternoon that he lost track of which prayers he had already said. The village carried these lapses for one another. Someone always remembered the line another had lost. Someone always nudged a hand toward a task a tired mind could do without thinking. When the 8th week turned, the calf coughed once, a deep sound that made everyone lean toward it, and then lowered its head and set to its feed like a creature that had remembered both appetite and dignity. Aliana did not smile, but the stiffness around her mouth softened as if it had been holding something brittle and had decided to set it down. Is it the ash, or something we can fix? The answer remained a braid of both. But the braid now had a ribbon of hope threaded through it thin, yes, but visible when someone held it up to the weak light and looked with honest eyes. They learned. in the weeks after the calf stood and the bees stayed silent, that a village can braid meanings as neatly as strathry strands. Salt, smoke, bread. The morning gatherings began to look like decisions with a blessing laid over them, and the evening blessings began to sound like decisions spoken gently so people would sleep. No one announced this change. It arrived because the light would not. Father Osric set a small bowl of salt on the chapel stone and touched 2 fingers to it before he blessed the loaves a household brought at week's end. Old Brenna, who carried the older words with the same lack of fuss with which she carried herbs, added a pinch of that same salt to the ash circle she traced at a threshold to persuade sickness to hesitate. Aliana, practical as bread, set a smouldering sliver of oak in a shallow dish and passed the smoke over the dough before it went to the oven, crossing herself without argument and whispering one of Brenna's short charms without apology. If grace could be cooked into food by attention, why should anyone worry if attention had 2 names? Salt for truth, smoke for memory, bread for life, Brenna said one evening when Ida asked why 3 and not 2 or 4. Father Osric, hearing her through the open door, did not correct her with verses about covenants or sacrifices. He said, simply, yes, and made the sign of the cross over the bowls on the table and over the hands that would carry them away. Wulfgar, who didn't mind what words were said as long as someone was counting, counted the loaves and nodded. The people who preferred to keep their faith tidy tried, once, politely, to object. If we ask 2 sets of guardians to mind the same door, one man said in the chapel after prayers, might they quarrel? Father Osric wiped the rim of the chalice and considered a reply sharp enough to satisfy his training, and soft enough to keep a neighbour. He settled on this: if 2 of us stand watch, one may nod and the other wake him. The door is better for both. Brenna, who had been waiting in the porch, snorted with approval and pretended she had not. Aliana, already halfway out to stoke the fire, thought of the calf's warm breath against her forehead and decided that whatever guarded them didn't seem the peevish sort. The rites gained their shape in the repetition of small movements. Every Sunday, whether or not the day deserved the name, a cloth appeared on the chapel table, and on it the bread of each household that could spare a portion. Father Osric blessed. Brenna braided a thin straw charm to tie around the largest loaf, and a child Bran, if he was quick to volunteer. Ida, if fairness demanded, turns carried the loaf to the storehouse, with 2 adults walking beside. On Wednesdays, which could still be found by the memory of hands even if the sky refused to keep count, a handful of salt was taken to the threshold of any home, with a sickness in it, and sprinkled in a circle small enough to step across and large enough to remind the sick that someone had taken the trouble to mark out a space where illness would be asked to behave, and each night, before the last lamp was pinched, a scrap of honest wood was made to smoulder, and its thin smoke was wafted about the room to persuade whatever wandered in the ash air to wander on. No one believed smoke alone could feed a child, or salt alone could hold a jar shut. That was not the point. The point was that gestures are tools, and tools that live in the hand make good sense when the mind is tired. If a loaf is blessed, the mouth that eats it remembers not to say, in the sourness the ash puts there, that life has stopped being a gift. If smoke has passed over the cradle, the woman at the hearth remembers that heat belongs where breath lies shallow. If salt marks a threshold, the man who avoided prayer on principle will still step carefully in and out, which slows his pace, which slows his speech, which keeps him from scaring the children with a fear that should be shared more gently, while rites quieted panic. Instruction fed the day. Brenna declared a foraging lesson each afternoon that did not bring visitors or urgent mending. People came the way they went to prayers, some with whole hearts, some because habit is a kind of faith. She began with nettles, because they are both insult and provision, and the lesson fit the hour. Take them like you would take a fence, carefully, and only as much as you need, she said, pinching the stem just below the top with practiced fingers. She showed how to fold the leaves against their sting, and how if you boil them until the green deepens, the nettle resigns its hostility and becomes useful. She told the story of nettle tea, helping a man's stiff hands remember the music of a plough. She did not claim miracles, only recalled this: a plant that defends itself will defend you if you treat it with manners. Ida repeated the phrase to Bran, solemn as a clerk. Sorrel came next, because even in the dim its mouth wakening, Sour could be coaxed from beds at the south wall. Brenna held up a spear of it and taught the children to choose leaves shaped like arrowheads, because sorrow and sorrel are kin, and too much of either will pucker the face. She showed how a handful chopped fine could persuade a pot of thickness to behave like food rather than duty, and how the sour made mouths water the body's own willingness to cooperate with the spoon. Never sneak in more than you'd admit to, she warned. Let the tongue agree to the bargain. Aliana, listening, smiled. That seemed a fair description of the whole season. Bargains best made aloud, when the nettles and sorrel no longer felt like strangers. Brenna brought out acorns, a basket of stubborn brown questions. She spoke about bitterness like a neighbor who will be tolerable if visited properly. They will feed you, but only if you take your time teaching them how, she said, cracking shells with a stone and showing how to grind the meat to expose the insolence. She taught the leaching soak and pour off, heat and rinse. A patience of water longer than pride until the bitter ran into the bucket, and what remained could be dried and ground fine. This is not bread as we wish for bread, she said. It is the kind we can have for now, and that makes it precious, not shameful. Father Osric attended that lesson and nodded more than once, making a quiet sermon of his agreement. Later, when he told the story of the manna that arrived, not as people preferred, but as they needed, pine in a bark was the lesson that made even the confident sit forward with respect. Brenna walked them into the fringe of the wood and stood beside a tall pine that had survived a dozen storms by minding its grip. She taught them to cut only slender curls from a living tree, and never to take a ring, leave a bridge for the life to walk over, she said, or you'll have fed today with tomorrow's corpse. She showed how to shave the inner layer like a ribbon, dry it, toast it without burning the faint sweetness away, and grind it to lift a thin porridge into the dignity of something a child might eat without turning the spoon into an enemy. She made them promise aloud to mark trees, to rest them between takings, to remember that foraging is not theft but a conversation. You must listen as much as you ask, she said. The woods will tell you when to stop. Wulfgar, who trusted wood mostly when it lay still in his hands, found himself agreeing to listen. Not all plants were invited into the pot. Brenna identified the liars, the mushrooms that would smile and kill, the lookalikes that wanted to be nettles without the willingness to serve, the generous greens that turn petty if they've drunk from bad water. She never dramatized danger. She simply made a list of what to refuse and wrote it on waxed board for the children to copy into their memory with their mouths. Say it, she told them. Saying saves you when thinking is hungry. Ida loved the recitation. Bran loved the way the words fit into his breath. The village loved that both children could be asked at any moment, and would answer as promptly as the bell dot, because knowledge that stays in one set of hands is brittle. The village made a small book. It was not elegant, a bundle of scraped parchments Father Osric had saved for the day someone would learn their letters. A leather thong, a cover cut from the good piece of hide that had been promised to a belt and surrendered to a larger cause. They called it the Book of Keeping. Sister Edda had sent along, with her notes, a promise to copy what the village wrote into the monastery's hands when the bishop's moot brought minds together, so nothing would vanish if one roof took fire or one thief took liberties. Aliana wrote slowly. She had not loved letters as a girl, but her slowness made the entries careful. How long to blanch nettle before it behaves? How many changes of water make an acorn admit it is food? How to set a rack along the south wall to catch the heat a stone still offers even when the sun seems stingy? How to seal a jar so that the mouse is made to go to someone else's house and think better of it on the way? Old Brenna insisted the book include prayers and charms, not because she expected the bishop to approve of them, but because leaving them out would be a lie, and lies turn books sour. Write the short blessing for smoke, she said, and Ida wrote, pass over and pass through. Leave what helps, carry what hurts. Father Osric read it and smiled, not because it matched any doctrine he had learned, but because it sounded like good advice for grief. He contributed his own lines. The blessing for salt, let truth be plain and hold what it touches. The blessing for bread, may what is broken hold us together. And the blessing for hands make and mend, stay and send. The pages looked odd together and perfectly honest. People argued amiably about where to put these practices in a day that had taken leave of the sun. They settled on this: teach foraging after the noon work when minds could still remember. Bless bread when a loaf left a house for the store, so everyone watched the leaving as well as the taking. Draw the salt circle at dusk, to remind people that thresholds deserve respect when fear gets fidgety. Send smoke through rooms before the last lamp, so you could watch the ember and measure the darkness before you closed your eyes. These little anchors held a day in place when Ash tried to push it around, even as the village grew more skilled at making survival look like method. The sense of being part of something larger returned in small proofs. A trader brought a crumb of rumor. A bishop would call a moot at the monastery. 2 months hence, if hence still meant anything, to share techniques and news, to argue kindly about causes, to make a plan that reached beyond one valley. The rumor brought a restless hope that was half relief and half dread. Relief, because to know others were in the same dim had its odd comfort. Dread, because asking for help always requires you to become more visible than hunger prefers. The decision to send delegates did not begin with a speech. It began with the recognition that the Book of Keeping had questions as well as answers. Aliana added a page titled Things We Do Not Yet Know, and under it, in her careful letters, she listed how long to keep seeds in dim before their patience snaps, whether bees can be coaxed with syrup if they lost the habit of flight, whether new beans should be soaked longer if the air has weight in it, how to trap more heat against the granary wall without starting a fire, whether a smokehouse can be made to behave inside a thick day. Father Osric added, how to speak comfort without promising weather. Brenna added, how to dry the inner bark so it does not mold when a week pretends to be a month. Wulfgar, less comfortable with writing, said to Aliana, ask if anyone has a way to make a fence that tells a wolf the truth. She wrote that, too, when the village gathered to choose who would go. They did not drag the decision through pride. They set out the criteria as if they were measuring a beam, strong enough to carry the road, light enough to bring back more than their own body. Memory that holds like wax, not like water. A mouth that can speak without bragging. Ears that do not fall asleep during talk of techniques. Enough humility to admit that someone else's way may be better. Enough stubbornness to keep asking when a half answer is given. People proposed names with a care that made the names feel like gifts laid on a cloth. Caden, Alina's cousin, rose first in the suggestions. Not because he was loud, but because he was rarely wrong about directions and never careless with other people's goods. He had a way of listening that made speakers feel their words had come to land, and a way of remembering that saved people the trouble of saying the same thing twice. He had once carried a note from the village to the monastery during a flood, timed his crossing between swollen riversides, and returned with the reply dry under his cloak. This was the sort of detail that recommends a person to a road. A woman named Mera, thick-armed from weaving and thin-ankled from walking to gather reed for her craft, was proposed next by Brenner, who knew the quiet endurance in her spine. Mera could count without chalk and wore a face that made people tell the truth. Father Osric's name was spoken by those who wanted a voice the bishop would recognize and respect, and then unspoken by others who feared to lose his steadiness in the chapel for even a few days. He suggested himself and then withdrew with a smile. "I will write the letter that goes with them," he said, "and the bishop will hear me that way without losing me here." The debate was not about merit so much as about fit. Wulfgar spoke for Caden's knowledge of paths and for a second delegate, with hands that could judge a tool built by another man. Brenner argued that someone who understood preserving and plant law should go, because questions about what a child can chew and live on are the same in every language. Aliana stayed quiet until she realized the quiet was starting to look like reluctance. And then she said, "Choose the one who comes back with something in their hands, even if it is only a better question." That settled Mera as surely as the way she set a warp in her frame. Caden and Marino one shouted. All agreed that preparations began at once, because the road asks for respect even when it will be walked under a mild sky. And this sky was many things, and mild was not one. The Book of Keeping yielded a second copy of its most necessary pages. Sister Edda had sent along thin sheets scraped smooth, and the village used them with a gratitude that made the pen feel like a ladle fishing out the last clear mouthfuls from a pot. A list of questions was written in tidy lines and then in rougher ones. Father Osric's letter greeted the bishop with courtesy and ended with a plain request. "Teach us what you have learned so we may keep our children alive, and we will send back what we learn so you may keep yours." He did not apologize for mixing rites in his village. He did not advertise it either. He chose words that allowed a bishop to bless what he could bless without, knowing every detail that would make a dignitary. To which gifts were chosen because going empty-handed into someone else's doorway turns a conversation brittle. Smoked eel, a delicacy that had become rarer and therefore more meaningful, was wrapped in woven reed and waxed cloth. A small cake of beeswax, precious, yes, but less precious than the relationship it could grease was, tucked into a pouch with a plate of straw that Ida insisted on tying herself. A belt with Mera's pattern, tight and even. A fisherman's knot that sits flat and saves rope. A fish hook hammered thin by the smith. A jar of sorrel paste that would make another valley's pot taste more awake. These were not tribute, exactly, but an introduction that said, "We are not asking without offering." The evening before the two were to set out, the blessing over salt, smoke, and bread drew everyone who could stand upright. The table was moved into the chapel so the rites could borrow each other's gravity. Aliana laid a loaf, still warm because the oven had been asked to give its best, beside Father Osric's bowl of salt. Brenna set the little clay dish with its smouldering sliver in the middle, and the smoke curled like writing in a language as old as stubbornness. Father Osric took the salt and said, "Let truth be plain and hold what it touches." He lifted the bread. "May what is broken hold us together." Brenna waved the smoke between Caden and Mera. "Pass over and pass through. Leave what helps, carry what hurts." Then, because Ida was looking at her as if a child's part had been forgotten, Brenna handed the straw plate to the girl, who tied it around the handle of the pack with the grave care of a magistrate affixing a seal. Caden, who never liked speeches, said, "We'll come back," and in those 3 words he put the weight of the book and the questions and the gifts and the eyes of the village. Mera added, "And not empty," which was the second promise on which the winter would now depend. Wulfgar brought out 2 staffs he had made from ash poles cured by the hearth. They were plain, straight, and true, which is what a road asks of a man and a woman. Father Osric slipped his letter into Mera's pack like a prayer that had learned to travel. It would have been easy, in a different year, for such a sending to swell with sentiment. This year had taught people to be sparing with what swells. There were embraces and the kind of laughter that keeps the throat warm. And then there were lists spoken one last time. The way to approach the fords if the water sulked. The farmstead where a old friend would offer a bed. Even if the bed was straw and the blanket was the story he loved to tell about the time he saw a comet. The gap in the hedgerow where a foot could find trouble if it forgot to lift high. Brenna pressed a small pouch of bitter herbs into Mera's hand and said, "If a fever tries to take you, make it work for its meal." Father Osric gave Caden a little wooden cross and Mera a smooth stone taken from the riverbed near the ford. "For your hands," he said, "when your minds are busy." When the lamps were pinched that night, smoke went through every room in the village, and the scent rose through the cracked thatch, and lay under the low sky as if mapping the homes that stubbornness was protecting. Aliana spread a pinch of salt on the threshold and stepped across it with bare feet to feel the grain under her skin, a reminder that the earth still offered a texture to push against. She cut a loaf in 3 part for the house, 1 for the store, 1 to go in a sack to be shared at the first place on the road where honest hunger met them. She did not ask God to do the travel. She asked for the kind of luck that looks like endurance, and for the kind of grace that looks like people telling the truth in rooms where it matters. The morning arrived shyly, but it arrived, and that was enough invitation. Caden and Mera stood at the edge of the square with their staffs and packs and the book bound tight against rain. Ida gave them the last small cake she had made with bran honey brushed thin, because extravagance needed witnesses and called it for courage. Bran gave them a piece of chalk, because roads sometimes forget their stories and need reminding. Wulfgar folded each of them into the brief, complete embrace of a man who has to let other people do the jobs he'd rather be doing himself. Father Osric spoke no blessing aloud. He lifted his hand and the movement said what words would have turned into banners: "Go, and come back, and let your feet keep their promises," as they set out. Brenna said to the listening children and the adults pretending they were not listening, "There will be a time when we will bless a loaf because it is beautiful, not because it is enough. Until then, we bless it because it is enough." She sent them to their chores with that in their ears, and the chores were grateful for the company. The smoke in the rooms thinned, the salt circle at the threshold winked in the low light like a quiet oath, and the bread on the shelf breathed its warm yeast breath into the day. Caden and Mera took the old road, not because it was shortest, but because the old stones under the ash remembered where to carry feet. As they disappeared into the grey beyond the last fence, the village did not sag. Hands reached for tasks. The nettles were waiting for their respectful scolding. The sorrel needed thinning so it could keep its generosity. The acorn meal wanted watching at the edge of the pan so it wouldn't turn surly. The book of keeping lay open on the table with a blank page at the back, ready to receive whatever returned. The rites would go on salt at dusk, smoke at lamp, bread at meeting, and the prayers would continue to sit inside the work like a flame inside an ember, hidden unless you blow and then willing to show itself again. What would you send? If you could send only 2 people and they carried your questions in their bones, which knowledge would you tuck into their packs? The tricks that save a spoonful a day, or the songs that make the saving feel like more than arithmetic? Would you bless their bread with words you were taught, or with words you learned, and would you worry about the difference while their backs moved away from you into the grey? The village answered in the only way that kept it honest, with both kinds of words, both kinds of gifts, and the expectation that what went out would return bigger than 2 bodies and the bag. The long dusk had taught them to set aside pride, not courage, and courage now wore 2 names. Caden, Mera, Act 3, the mathematics of hunger. They discovered that hunger could be taught to behave if you treated it like arithmetic and not like an omen. Numbers reduced panic to the size of a spoon. The village did not vote for mathematics. It arrived unavoidable as ash. Aliana spread a cloth on the table, set the book of keeping open beside the scale the smith had made long ago for trading days, and began learning how to turn appetites into measures and measures into days. Her mother had shown her once, as a girl, how to judge a loaf by the feel of it when a palm could tell the truth better than an eye. Now she taught her palm to be a ledger. A mouthful became a unit. A spoonful followed, smaller but more obedient. A thumb joint became a way of agreeing on slice width without insulting anyone's pride. No one liked the transformation of their bodies into arithmetic, but they liked the way arithmetic kept a person from lying to himself by accident. They called it the mouth rule. Children counted as 3/4 of a mouth unless they were in the middle of a growth spurt and woke weeping from dreams that had forgotten to feed them. The elderly counted as a mouth and a half on days when their breath argued with stares, on days when they insisted they were fine and lied badly. Neighbors doubled their share anyway out of habit and called the excess medicine. Workers who spent hours at the river or with the axe gained an extra spoon without announcement. Women who nursed infants did not count at all, because no number could afford the work their bodies performed, and so households proxied for them by adding a portion to the pot whenever they could, without turning the generosity into spectacle. The mouth rule sat in the book of keeping, written carefully by Aliana, with notes in the margin in Brenna's sharper hand. On cold days, raise by 1 spoon if you can. On feast days that are not feasts anymore, lower by 1 and sing longer. The grain allowance lay like a fence line around the week. Each household pledged a store and a schedule. Alina's family took enough barley to turn to porridge. In the morning being a domestic fiction, the village agreed to maintain a nun. Wheat to coax into 2 small loaves across 7 days, padded with acorn meal that did not confess its presence if treated gently. Beans, those patient accountants of the plant world, now counted for more than pride had once allowed. they softened overnight in water that carried a faint taste of ashno. One knew if that mattered, and then simmered with a bay leaf. Brenna had dried last summer, as if she had known this winter was coming and had decided not to tell, because knowledge should not be allowed to frighten joy. Oil was rationed by wick. A lamp that burned without smoking could stay lit for the length of one song and one story. A lamp that sulked or smoked was pinched without ceremony, and its wick trimmed as if it had sworn and needed correcting. The storehouse ledger received marks that grew neater with practice. Wulfgar had started with tally cuts. On a plank he trusted wood more than wax, but the notches multiplied until the plank began to look like an angry story. Father Osric carried the wax tablet to the table and translated notches into lines. Lines into little numbers he had not expected to need outside of the tithe. He spoke the entries aloud as he wrote, like a man tying knots he didn't want to slip. Households listened for their names, not with suspicion, but with the alertness of people whose souls had migrated to their stomachs and needed calling back. The key still hung on the chapel's nail, where anyone with a bad hour could find it. And everything about the ledger, the numbers, the speaking aloud, the visible key taught the same lesson. Trust is easier to carry when it has bones. House after house rearranged itself to fit the calculations of light and heat. Hearths became more public. A family with a wide fireplace and a steady draft hosted a second family whose chimney sulked. Two households traded rooms for the season. A loft that held warmth better swapped for a ground floor room near a neighbor who woke early and lit stoves as if duty were a flame that needed his particular hands. The old Roman granary wall, hoarding what heat the sky refused, gave its advantage to the community kitchen they built from boards that had once been a fence and a door that had once been a lid. The village, which had loved privacy in the way people do when the world is generous, now loved proximity as a new kind of grace. Conversation thickened, the soup lamp hours became a kind of coin. A meeting room kept 2 hours a week for disputes because arguments held in the dark go crooked. The hearth in Brenna's cottage won a lamp hour, less an hour. Ida called it on afternoons when hands were too cold to think and the mind wanted heat to carry instructions across the fingers. The smith kept a lamp for the time required to shape a hook or a hinge that would save 5 hours of wrestling in the dim. Father Osric took a lamp for baptisms and burials, flame for beginnings and endings, so people would not feel like paper being passed from hand to hand without regard. The village discovered that light applied well was not mere luxury. It reordered the day to protect the parts of human life that hunger would eat first, if allowed: courtesy, craft, ceremony. It helped to name the pots. Eliana labeled one with a small scratch near the handle, honest. The honest pot held what the day could rightly boast without stealing from tomorrow. Another pot, heavier at the base and temperamental about heat, she called stubborn. The stubborn pot took cheap ingredients and turned them into something a mouth could believe in if given time. The book of keeping gained a page called Pot Politics, in which she wrote, with wry patience, which recipes belonged to which moods, which days deserved which pot, and how long beans required before admitting dignity. Brenna added a note about roasting acorn meal dry before adding liquid. It made the smell shift from impatient to comforting. It helped to name the pots. Aliana labeled one with a small scratch near the handle, honest. The honest pot held what the day could rightly boast without stealing from tomorrow. Another pot, heavier at the base and temperamental about heat, she called stubborn. The stubborn pot took cheap ingredients and turned them into something a mouth could believe in if given time. The The Book of Keeping gained a page called Pot Politics, in which she wrote, with wry patience, which recipes belonged to which moods, which days deserved which pot, and how long beans required before admitting dignity. Brenner added a note about roasting acorn meal dry before adding liquid. It made the smell shift from impatient to comforting. Fish, fickle in the dark water, added their own columns to the ledger. Nets cast slowly, with breath and thought aligned, returned more than nets thrown hard with complaint. The river became a teacher. A man named Rolf, who had always thought of fish as stubborn citizens who needed to be tricked, learned to set his net like an invitation. He stopped using the word trap aloud. He told the river, before he lowered his lines, what he hoped for in plain terms, and though he knew the water did not bargain, he said, saying his hope calmed his hands, and his hands did better work when calm. He started bringing home enough to warm the children's nights without making the village resent his luck. Aliana once whispered, watching him, "Hunger changes a person's verbs." The mathematics stretched beyond food to warmth. The ash beneath the coals became its own schedule. People learned the life of an ember, how long it would hold if tucked and turned like an infant, how much ash to shelter it with to allow it to show up later as a competent blaze. They invented the practice of borrowing fire, which the old ones remembered by other names. A child with a lidded pot could walk to a neighbor's hearth when a family's ember failed and carry home a live coal as if escorting a king. The right because it became one didn't require priests or charms, only the skill to walk evenly and the humility to ask. Ida loved being entrusted with such errands. Brenner argued that a village that has taught its children to borrow fire will borrow hope and return it in good condition. In the Book of Keeping, the column of losses was written without shame. 2 jars failed in a week because a mouse had learned to be bold. Father Osric wrote, beside Alina's entry, raise the shelf and polish the lids. A handful of beans turned musty in a larder that wept during a wind. Brenner added, lift the floor planks when the east comes. It brings tears. The times something went wrong did not arrive as accusations. They were knowledge in heavy coats. There were also gains, a new way to stack wood that drank less fire to say yes. A trick of propping the oven door with a shard of tile to persuade a loaf to keep its temper. Choice became a unit. Aliana could trade the sweetness of her last honey thread to make a child's fever swallow the bitter herbs, or save it for the day a pregnant woman refused meat and needed something to tempt her back to strength. She could spend a lamp on an hour of mending that would keep a coat from apologizing at the wrong moment, or save the oil to carry the community through a meeting that needed clarity. Wulfgar could put his strength to hauling stone for a windbreak at the south wall or spend it, pacing the fields with a scowl that made the air feel scolded. He chose the stone more often than not. It mattered where effort landed. The mathematics of hunger taught everyone the same quiet calculus. The cost of a thing is not what you spend. It is what you will not be able to spend later because of what you chose now. Every 7 days, 7 by decree, not by light, the village gathered to revise. The ledger read aloud prompted adjustments. 2 households would merge for the week because one had a cough, traveling on its bedding. 3 children would eat together at Alina's table because she welcomed the clatter and wanted to spare their mothers the worry of pretending not to be frightened of empty plates. The smith traded an extra hour of his fire for a bundle of dried mushrooms and a promise of 2 future hooks. He had learned, he said, that good iron slept better when it knew it had a reason to be honest. Father Osric tried to offer someone else his lamp hour, and was vetoed by Brenna, who accused him of martyrdom with affectionate disgust and told him that rituals were arithmetic too. They held people to themselves. People spoke more plainly now. They did not hide appetite behind modesty, not because modesty had lost value, but because it cost too much to go around it to get to the truth. A man with a face drawn by a new widowhood admitted he had eaten the extra spoon under his roof and asked for a replacement with the kind of apology that does not humiliate. A woman who had always been proud of her independence let herself be walked to the community hearth when the ash in her house kept pretending it was sulking and would not catch. Children learned to say, "I am still hungry," and sometimes the answer was, "So are we," and sometimes the answer was, "Here, little one," and both answers were as honest as a winter that did not fear words. No one escaped the moral arithmetic. A handful of men argued that their work justified larger helpings. The village adjusted their portions and added, on the same page, the expectation that those extra calories would reappear as speed in building windbreaks and strength in lifting timbers. The men noticed that the book of keeping always folded back to the page where blame did not grow. From that, they learned to argue about numbers without arguing about worth. When one of them, tired and bitten by the day, muttered that a neighbor's boy ate like a wolf and worked like a squirrel, Brenna flicked his ear and said, "The boy is learning to be both. The winter will tell him which to be when Aliana," who never liked to leave a bruised sentence lying around, added an extra spoon to the boy's bowl on a day he had split kindling without being asked and pointed to the ledger as if it were a window. Debts and receipts. The mathematics extended to sound. The bell rang for ration hours to soft strikes for gathering 3. Clear and for warning, one long note that trembled. People learned the code the way they learned nettle, without fuss and with gratitude for a language that replaced shouting. Sound saved lamp oil. The smith hung a small chime from his lintel. When certain tasks were completed, he tugged the chime to keep his neighbors in step. In the chapel, Father Osric learned to sing the psalms slower, less for drama than because long notes required less lamp time than many short ones. He instructed the congregation to breathe together between lines. The hush acquired its own warmth. When neighbors shared hearths, they also shared stories. This, too, was math. Narratives were counted as provisions. A good story could make 2 thin slices seem like a meal, stretch a lamp half an hour, hush a quarrel that wanted to grow teeth. Brenna told the one about the winter when she had eaten pine and had learned not to take bark from the same tree twice. She made it funny and the tree noble. Father Osric told a saint's life in which the saint turned down a feast because he had already eaten at a poor man's table. He delivered it without the sharpness that might taste like scolding. Aliana told the truth about the calf. It was illness and patience, not miracle, and both belonged to the village. Ida and Bran invented small adventures for the nets with names and the lamps that thought they were moons. No one corrected them because the lamps burned longer under praise. Some nights, even after all the arithmetic, hunger walked like a thin man in an unkind cloak. It pulled at the elbows of those who had pledged to wait until midwinter to touch the store and made them wake with the conviction that midwinter had slid under the door while they slept. The key on the chapel nail shone faintly where the last of the day's light refused to die. A hand that had never stolen from a neighbor wondered whether a spoonful taken now would be confessed later in some honest balance. Father Osric, who understood temptation by practice and profession, placed his chair where he could watch the key without making a show of guarding it. He called it sitting with the lamp because names matter, and he offered no lectures to the men and women who walked in at odd hours and warmed their hands at the stub of flame, before leaving again with their own pockets empty. To the child who once came with her chin trembling, he gave a spoon of sorrel paste and told her to take it to her mother and say it came from a man who had counted wrong. The ledger recorded that, too, under a column labeled mercy, and then there were the small mysteries that arithmetic could not explain, but had to accommodate. A jar of honey appeared again on the chapel sill, a smaller jar this time, as if the beekeeper, a beekeeper, still existed, were down to his last sweetness. The jar went into the common cupboard with a note in Brenner's hand, for fevers, for days when a baby forgets to latch, for the word yes when the room has heard too much no. The ledger did not ask for the donor's name. It asked for restraint. When the first true miscount arrived, it came like a cough, not a chest-rattling collapse, but a small missing that turned into a measure that turned into a worry. Aliana alerted the storehouse keeper this week. The smith and, together they checked lids and seals. A cup, maybe two, gone from one sack with a tie that had behaved. A little flour dust decorating the plank beneath as if something had shaken its coat there. They did not call a meeting. They wrote it down under unaccounted and sat with the number the way you sit with a guest who avoids your eye. The next day, a similar loss from another sack and a thin line in the dust near the baseboard that did not belong to any mouse. Brenner put a finger into the line and came up with a paste of flour and something damp, and she did not say the word she thought. The village tightened its practice without tightening its throat. The lamp in the storehouse was moved from the corner to the center beam. The key remained on the nail. To remove it would have been to accuse everyone in a room where the guilty might admire the company. Father Osric asked for 2 volunteers to keep the warm watch at the chapel in the late hours, and he chose men and women who wore their quiet like wool. They were told to notice, not to confront. The mathematics of hunger had taught the village that justice without understanding multiplies loss. On the 4th night of this new attention, Wulfgar, who had taken his turn at the warm watch, thought he heard would speak a whisper that did not belong to the building's honest creaks. He stood and loosened his posture so his bones would not crack and announce him. In the storehouse, the lamp's circle of light lay obediently on the floorboards and made the shadows crouch. The sacks were lined up like careful stoics. The line of flour at the baseboard had been smudged, not by a mouse, not by a broom. The door, strong and newly planed, fit well enough to admit almost nothing. Almost Aliana joined him, her moccasins speaking the language of caution. She put her palm flat on the plank by the threshold and felt for the tremor of steps that had recently passed. Nothing then there a dampness, not of weather, near the sill. She lifted the latch and pushed the door softly. Outside, the ashno lay shallow, a skin on the earth. The storehouse wall threw a short shadow where the lamp's light leaked through a knot in the door. In that slanted square of half-light, the ground told the truth. Markings like questions, small and careful, travelling from the sill to the path. Not boot prints, bare feet. No too narrow at the heel, too careful in the toe. Someone had wrapped their feet in cloth, perhaps. To steal silence, they followed the marks to the lane where they deepened. Then split one set slipped, toward the hedgerow where old fennel stalks etched the air. The other set, fainter, kept to the cartwheel rut as if it preferred to be mistaken for shadows. Wulfgar crouched and measured one with his hand. A child could have made it, but hunger teaches grown feet to shrink. The prince did not go toward the houses. They went toward the river, The river at night took the dim and needed it until the world was something a person could drown in. The path down was not a path so much as a series of recollections shared by those who had walked it sober and asleep. Aliana moved ahead, less by sight than by the memory of her own weight on these steps in summers that had sworn themselves to other stories. At the last bend before the shore, the ash was disturbed in a patchwork like a badly mended cloak. Someone had waited there long enough to shift from one leg to the other. The footprints were more certain at the edge, turned this way and that by indecision, then gone. Not faded gone. Wulfgar lowered to a knee and touched the wet, grey grit. The river breathed with that steady patience that terrifies and comforts in equal measure. Aliana tasted ash in the air and something else, a sweetness like bread gone old. Downriver, someone had set a lamp that now swung low on a branch knowe. One in the village had loaned it. Or perhaps it was a star the water had decided to practice being, except the sky had fewer stars now and the water kept this one close. The lamp's motion dyed the surface, then the dark erased it. Behind them, on the path, a small sound, so small it could have been a vole, so full of fear it could have been a broken promise. Aliana turned. The hedgerow held its breath. Wulfgar's fingers, still in the river mud, tightened on the far side of the bank, almost invisible in the clutch of willows where the roots made a small aisle. Something shifted a body, small or hunched, leaned and straightened. Cloth whispered. A figure, wrapped in a blanket the colour of dust, lifted what might have been a sack and melted deeper into the grey, following the river's curve as if it were a script they had practiced. Alina's first word left her mouth without permission. Wait. It went nowhere the way bells had gone nowhere on the first day of the long dusk. The figure paused, or the willow shivered, and then the pause dissolved. The footprints on their side of the river stopped at the waterline and did not return. Whether the thief had waded, or a boat had been hiding in shadow, or the river had collaborate, none of the answers fit cleanly into the ledger. They were left with questions that would sit under unaccounted until someone dared to move them to explained. Wulfgar rose, brushed the ash from his palms, and looked at Aliana as if the ground had offered them homework. We can count, he said. We cannot pretend we did not see. She nodded. The lamp downriver stilled, then went out as if a breath had been asked to stop. The river made no opinion known. They turned and climbed, each step an entry in a column that would need a neat hand in the morning. By the time they reached the square, a thin line of neighbours stood at their doors, summoned by instinct and that strange sense by which a village knows when the world has tilted half a degree. Father Osric stepped from the chapel with the key in his hand and the ledger tucked under his arm. Brenna held a coal in a pan to keep it quick for whatever needed warming. Ida and Bran, carried back to bed by Wulfgar, in his stare, and by Aliana in her worry, watched from their window through a slit in the curtain and did not speak. As if words might start a slide they could not stop. The store had been disturbed. The prints led to the river. The mathematics of hunger, which had felt like a fence that kept wolves out and children in, now felt like a fence someone had learned how to climb. Aliana set her palm flat on the ledger's cover as if to steady it and said, We must count again, and then, after the kind of pause that makes neighbours place their feet more carefully, Brenna said, very softly, and we must count differently. The bell did not ring. The lamp at the chapel guttered and then righted itself. Somewhere downriver, a small clink sounded, a stone shifted, or a boat met a hidden branch, or a hand chose less careful work for one heartbeat. The night swallowed the sound with the same appetite with which it had taken the prince. Act for wolves and winter fevers. Wolves came down as if the hills had emptied their pockets and let them roll toward the fields. At first it was rumor, the shape of a movement seen from the corner of an eye, the way a shadow decided to lengthen against custom. Then it was prince, for round and certain. Pressed into the ash knell, at the edge of the barley where nothing had grown as it should. Ida laid her palm in one print and swallowed. It covered the soft heel of her hand and curved past her lifeline. Wulfgar squatted over them with the sober respect he gave good tools. He measured distance between steps the way he measured spans for a beam, and said nothing because nothing needed saying. Even the hens understood. They folded into themselves and watched the hedges as if a bad story had taken up residence there. The dogs refused to bark. They were not cowards. They were unsettled. They paced the thresholds, leaned their heads against men's legs, and raised their muzzles to the dim to drink a scent that told them kin had come and not for courtesy. Aliana stroked the rib of the older dog and felt a tremor run down the length of him like a wire pulled too tight. He whined once, an apology for a courage that had grown complicated. "You don't have to warn us," she said. "We are already warned." The dog's eyes thanked her for letting him keep his dignity. When the first long wolf note lifted from the farther heath, thin as a needle and twice as sharp, the dogs did not answer. They lay down and tried to convince their chests to move at a useful pace. The village adjusted. It was what they were good at now. Bells that Brenna had taught the children to hang low on the gateposts were moved higher and multiplied, so the wind could pull information from them at different tones. Fish bones strung on lines rattled like rain if anything brushed the fence. Aliana tore strips from a ruined tunic and dipped them in a paste of ash and urine. The old stink that wolves dislikened tied them along the bottom rails. Wulfgar took the stoutest poles and ran a new brace behind the byre door. If a wolf decided to test the hinge, it would meet an unfamiliar argument. Father Osric did not bless the fence. He blessed the hands that built it, and that felt right to everyone. Night altered its manners. Fires were banked not to sleep but to wait upright. The warm watch moved from chapel to yard edges and swapped chairs for walking. Two at a time circled the lanes with a careful silence, not to sneak, but because sound spills, and they had learned to keep what was theirs. When a watcher passed a window, a hand inside the house lifted a curtain with 2 fingers to show that someone within was counting the same hours. If a chime sounded on the west gate, the watchers on the east gate listened and did not answer. The wolves did not need to be invited to a conversation that had already reached the important points. They did test the fence. It was a polite shove the first time, the wood's small complaint loud in the thin air. The byre door held. Inside, the calf that had tempted despair once lowered its head and chewed as if chewing with a proper reply to any inquiry. The wolves circled, their pads printing questions in the yard. They understood doors and patience and hunger. Hunger, among all creatures, is a language without accent. The river kept its voice, which helped. Its thick mutter gave the night something older to listen to than fear. Men who could not sleep rolled the names of its bends in their mouths like smooth stones. Women who had learned to tell the time by the steps of a song hummed under their breath and set the pace for stirring and for thinking. When the wolves called from the ridge again closer, now the dogs raised their heads and chuffed, a bass note that claimed the houses without declaring war. Brenna stood in her doorway with a coal in a pan and a bunch of juniper to lay across it. The priest's bowl of salt shone like a small moon near her elbow. Neither rite dared the wolves to do anything. Each asked the people to stay themselves. Cold fevers arrived like uninvited cousins who know the back door. They slipped into lungs already annoyed by ash, into joints already honest about age. They took up lodging in the chests of men whose shirts had stayed damp a heartbeat too long, and in babies whose mouths were still learning the surety of milk. The village called them the thin fire because they burned without radiance. A person with the thin fire shivered under blankets and could not be persuaded to choose between heat and air. Brenna took out her willow and her yarrow, brewed bitterness, and promised it would change its face to mercy if swallowed like duty. She mixed honey where honey could be spared and said aloud, for anyone who wanted to hear it, that a sweet spoon is a true spoon when it must be. Father Osric sat the warm watch inside now and then, holding a cup near a mouth that didn't love waking. He did not try to speak theology into fever. He told little stories with short, honest endings. People took the endings like sips. Deaths came. The first was a gentle woman named Lysa, whose oldest boy had been born on a harvest day in a year the village had been proud to live in, and whose youngest girl had come in a February when lambs had been poorly advised by weather. Lysa had not made a fuss when the light withdrew. She had curled into duty like a cat with a warm stone. The thin fire took her quietly. Her breath, at the last, made 2 small clouds and then chose to leave. The house received her silence like a parcel no one wants and everyone must sign for. Aliana washed her and combed her hair and tied it with the good ribbon. Brenna drew the salt circle at the door and did not comment on Father Osric's tears, which kept falling and did not muddy the rite. In the chapel, the candles trembled as if breathing had become expensive. The children were told exactly what had happened. Lysa had died. They were not told she had gone before or gone away, because departures suggested the possibility of return, and grief needs honest maps. Chose a place for the graves where the ash lay thinnest and the ground gave back the sound of the spade, as if it still remembered its summer. It was the slight rise near the hawthorns, a place where people had sometimes taken bread in kinder years because the breeze there told a cleaner story. They began a row, and the row began the cemetery, and the cemetery began a practice. Each grave received 3 things: a pinch of salt, because truth should be told even to the dead; a wisp of smoke, because memory travels better when it can see the path; a crust of bread set on the mound, because life continues on both sides of sorrow. Father Osric said the prayers with the gravity he used for marriages. Brenna braided a straw loop and hung it on the hawthorn near Lysa's name. The hawthorn's thorns took the loop from her with the delicacy of a midwife. The children were told to kick neither dirt nor stones at this place. They were allowed to ask questions and to answer each other when adults could not. The wind pulled the smoke a little and laid it out like a thread to be picked up later by whoever might need it. 2 more graves joined the first before the week completed itself. Ralph's mother, whose hands had known the nets longer than his had, and a baby who had not yet received a name beyond the one whispered at her birth. The row looked small and felt enormous. Wulfgar carved markers from the cleanest boards he could spare and cut the letters as if their edges could protect the names from being rubbed away by time's blunt hand. Aliana added each name to the book of keeping on a page labelled, "Those we will not let go." Father Osric took a copy on thin parchment for the monastery's records, not because he trusted their shelves more than his people's minds, but because paper and memory should be arranged like two hands under a body being carried. The wolves circled, learning the sound of grief. That night they sang from the ridge again, and the dogs, pressed against human shins at the doors of houses, closed their eyes rather than risk crying out. Brenna said to the air, "Not here," not as a command, but as a request addressed to a world that has sometimes been known to grant small mercies, when asked politely by tired people. Whether the wolves heard her or only heard the wind is not a question a ledger can answer. They stayed to their ridge and did not test the fence that night. In the morning, Ida found their prints at the place where the road leans toward the heather, and she plucked a thread from her scarf to tie on a thorn as if to say, "We saw you, and we kept our place." Winter fevers continued their arithmetic. Some who fell into them climbed out with lungs that unlearned the habit of scolding. Others did not. Brenna taught compresses and poultices, and the stubborn art of patience, the body's slow reconsideration. "Do not make promises for a fever," she told Father Osric. "Only make room." He nodded and made room. Oil was spared for the room of the dying and the room of the birthing, and for the hour each day when hands needed to sew and sharpen. The rest of the hours learned to be brave without flame. The village discovered that the ear is a lamp. You can light a person by listening until they glow enough to warm themselves. Hope did not arrive as a messenger in a bright cloak. It came, as always, disguised as a child's invention. Bran, who had grown tired of watching lamp wicks with the respect of an accountant, devised a game he called Coal Relay. The rules were simple, with a lidded pot and a spoon for a baton. Teams would carry a glowing coal from one hearth to another, without letting it cough ash onto the floor and without letting the lid bang. It was serious in the way good games are serious. The children learned a dancer's step, a patience in their feet. They turned borrowing fire into a festival. Each household kept a tally notch on the roster when its coal arrived and made a tiny cheer that spent no more energy than a whisper and somehow brought back 3 heartbeats worth of warmth. Adults pretended not to watch, but changed their pace to suit the game's music. The village found that laughter when shaped to fit inside the math of scarcity lengthened. The day by the width of a smile. Ida invented wolf steps. You walked the lane in silence, heels soft, then paused with one foot lifted, neck alert, breath thin, and then sank forward like a shadow changing its mind. The point was to become so quiet that the bells did not answer you, so aware that you could name what the river was saying without hearing it. Children learned balance, learned to make their bodies The dogs, finally curious enough to rise out of their refusal, sometimes joined, mirroring the children's poise, and for a strange handful of minutes, village dogs and a worry they had in common moved through the same narrow door of skill and came out into the same courtyard of calm. A song began as a chant at the table when hands were numbed with cold and a spoon needed company. Brenna started it with no intention to start anything. She was stirring porridge and naming the steps to keep a young mother's mind from stalling. "Keep the coal," she said. "Share the coal. Carry the coal home." The words met the steam and did not fight it. Ida fitted a tune around them, not fancy, not borrowed, something that knew how to sit on a word and warm it without cooking it. Bran added the drum of a wooden spoon on the rim of the pot. Aliana smiled without meaning to. Wolfgar, who preferred the speakable to the singable, found his foot marking time under the bench of its own accord. Keep the coal, share the coal, carry the coal home. The line found jobs. It measured the walk between houses. It set the notch for how long a lamp could stay bravely lit and still leave enough oil for a night when someone would be born into delay. It travelled under doors and rested on pillows with the weight of a hand that does not need to say anything more than still. Here, the song acquired verses the way a wall acquires ivy. Keep the bread, share the bread. Carry the bread whole. Keep the name, share the name. Carry the name told. Father Osric contributed one without admitting it was his. Keep the time. Share the time, carry the time slow, Brenner added. Keep the seed, share the seed, carry the seed sown. None of it was poetry worth copying in a great book. All of it was the sort of speaking that saves an hour from breaking. People sang under their breath as they tightened the lashings on fences, as they boiled willow into obedience, as they counted beans and pretended the counting was a kind of story, and it was Dot in the yard of the buyer. The wolves tested the fence once more and found a new thing, a line of chalk. Ida had drawn along the base rail with stones she had ground herself. She had mixed the chalk with a handful of salt and the last of the crushed juniper. It was not a ward in any official sense. It was a child's insistence that a line can be a line even when the world is pretending to be formless. The wolves paused there, or seemed to, and the dogs, who had refused to bark for days, stood and made a sound that was not a bark and not a whine, but the old sound that says to kin, "My den." The wolves left a gift of silence. Whether it was respect or coincidence did not matter. Children slept that night without trying to listen through walls. Fevers did not make bargains, but they did obey certain courtesies. The worst of the coughs passed through one end of the village and then seemed to grow bored, as if the disease had the attention span of a dissatisfied guest. Brenner's store of willow thinned. The honey jar sighed and revealed its glass bottom. The yarrow sprigs dried with their skeleton prettiness intact and were used anyway. The Book of Keeping received new entries, a recipe for onion poultice that had rescued a child's night, a note about pinching the nose and coaxing sips when thirst had been tricked by cold, a little drawing by Bran of how much smoke a room could hold before it turned against the lungs. Father Osric wrote a prayer for the dying that was shorter than any he had been taught and perhaps more honest. It asked for less pain and for the world to be gentle with the survivors. He read it to Brenner before he used it, and she nodded, pleased by the lack of decoration, when the fourth grave joined the row. A boy nearly, a man whose laughter had often been a little too loud and therefore dear. The wolves sang from the ridge as if answering, and the dogs, who had regained some modest courage from the children's quiet games, pressed into the procession and paced out the walk with their heads low. The ground took the spade with a soft sound that made each person feel the weight of their own bodies in their own bones. The bread crust went to the mound. The smoke thread lifted. The pinch of salt glittered like honesty. Father Osric read the short prayer, and then, because it is indecent to leave grief without company, he sang the refrain the children had invented. He sang badly. The village answered him in the same tune, better. The wolves' song thinned, or perhaps ears turned inward to hear a human song better, when the dawn, stingy as ever, pressed the rim of its grey against the fields. A fox trotted along the hedgerow with the insouciance of a thing that cannot afford philosophy. It paused at Ida's chalk line and hopped over with a graceful practicality that made Ida grin in spite of herself. "Foxes don't read," she said. "Only wolves do." Bran argued on principle. Aliana laughed and let the absurdity spend some of the day's worry. In the ledger beneath losses and mercy, she added a third column, almost without thinking. Kept, and under it wrote, "The calf eats." The dogs stood. The song stuck. She left a blank space below for future additions. Hope, it turned out, prefers to be written down even when it is shy. News came in light threads. A shepherd from 2 ridges over said his flock had learned new paths in the dim, and that he had learned to follow them instead of insisting on the old way. His child had invented a whistle pattern that the sheep liked, and now the pattern travelled ahead of the flock like a map drawn in air. A right from the next valley shared a trick for setting a second inner shutter to catch house heat, a false wall of planks that persuaded a room to behave smaller and therefore warmer. Father Osric took these notes down and sent them with a novice to the monastery, where Sister Edda added them to the pile of scents that would be laid out at the moot. Caden and Mara were still on the road, somewhere under the same stingy sky, learning and offering and keeping their bodies aimed homeward like needles in a compass that believed in promises. The wolves kept circling. Some nights they laid their voices across the fields like a net. Some nights they kept their counsel and left the village to practice its own music. The dogs learned to sleep with their ears half open, without cursing themselves for it. The children learned where not to run and how to stand when standing between lamb and hedge. They learned that fear is like cold dew. Do not banish it, you dress for it. Men and women whose hands had learned numbers now taught those hands to hold the dead and the living, without confusing the respect due to both. The first row of graves, under the ash, did not become a wall. It became a promise about how to walk in the dark. On a night when frost tried to write its own bright grammar on the eaves and failed because the air would not be truthful enough to shine. Brenna stepped onto her threshold with a pan of coals and a fist of rosemary and spoke. To the seeing world and to whatever else might have been listening. "We are not finished," she said. "We will keep the coal. We will share the coal. We will carry the coal home." In the next house, Aliana was pinching the lamp. In the house beyond that, a baby decided to try laughter for the first time and liked the taste of it. In the yard, the dogs lifted their heads in the same minute and sighed, as if they had read the same sentence in the same book and finally understood the point. Up on the ridge, a wolf answered itself and then stopped, perhaps to listen. Morning arrived the way a poor man pays a debt reluctant and precise. The row under the hawthorns held. The lamps gave what they could and then rested. The fences kept their minds. Fever moved along and stopped at one house and then decided the day hadn't earned another victory and left. Children lined up for coal relay with the solemnity of dancers waiting for a drum. The song threaded through the lanes, letting even the dogs believe for a quarter hour that a tune sung together could radiate the kind of heat that does not go out when pinched. The village squared its shoulders against the dim and discovered, not for the first time, that shoulders remember how to carry what they must when a hand from the next house touches the load and lifts, even just a finger's worth.